Greetings, my fellow Americans, and welcome to another episode of the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. I'm your host, Ron Glick. Tonight we're going to talk about plea bargains, and specifically how they affect and empower the Great Montana Conspiracy through influx of monies to the prison for profit system. Sound complicated? Well, watch some of my other podcasts that come before this. Before we get started, would you please hit the like and subscribe button on this podcast? Whichever format you're watching it, or whatever platform you're watching it in, whether it be YouTube or the original source of this podcast, which is monspiracy.podbean.com, or if there are any other areas that this podcast delivers to, please take the time to show your appreciation, like it, subscribe it, and most importantly, share it with your friends and family. Post the links that you see this on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, whatever media platform you frequent. Share it with your friends, your followers, encourage people to watch it. The more people that watch this information, the more informed we are, the better chance we have of affecting change. Now, historically, the trial by jury has been a cornerstone of democratic justice. You recognize the term trial by jury, jury. Juries remove government from the judging process. Essentially, it keeps government from acting as a totalitarian institution and passing judgments upon citizens it just doesn't like. You have kings, you have monarchies, you have tyrants who simply judge, jury, and executioner. Well, juries are designed to bypass that, to keep the government out of the judicial process, in as much as it kept the decision making of whether someone was innocent or guilty to a group of people who are not involved in government. It provides citizens a chance to decide the guilt, the innocence, or even the monetary awards that an individual might receive under different circumstances. In some cases, they need to decide what level of punishment to pass down to the defendant if the person is found guilty. And this acts as a barrier against government abuse. Well, in principle it does, because the government has to convince people, normal people, who have any pre-existing loyalty to the government, presumably, that the government is right in bringing this charge or this case. The problem is that greater than 90% of the people charged with crimes today never see a jury. That's both federal and state systems across the board. Over 90% of people who are accused never see a jury. It's a constitutional right that the vast majority of accused people in the United States are coerced into surrendering, because in our broken country, plea bargaining has been legalized. Now, maybe before we start talking about one thing, we need to talk about something else. We always have to talk about what came before, what led to this, what brought us to this point. In this case, we need to understand about the right to a jury trial and why it is so important, both where it came from and how it affects the fairness and equality of any democratic system. The concept of a trial by jury has been around since ancient Greece. It's been around longer than that, more than likely, but ancient Greece is where the most records exist that suggest that they had institutionalized a proper jury system. This is dating back as far as 500 BCE. These juries could be huge, 500 or more people. It literally could be just a crowd of people all lined up to hear this particular case. It was simply a matter of how many people volunteered on any given day. And of course you got paid for volunteering, but it's just, so there was never a limit as to how many people. It wasn't like the first 10 people, the first 20 people. Please sign up to be on the jury. You get paid to be there, and you sit around all day and you listen to a case, a prosecution that's made, and you get to decide by the vast majority of the crowd whether you're guilty or innocent. This is primarily the city of Athens was well known for this, but there was no actual limit to the number of people, so it obviously does not reflect our modern system. We actually have a limit of 12 in the United States, on criminal cases 6 for civil cases. But of course there's other elements in history that have affected the formation of the modern jury system. Essentially, there was one group in the Germanic territories in medieval times. Essentially, was a group of good men who were charged with keeping justice by becoming basically layman judges. Now, this was under the Holy Roman Empire. The process preceded the Holy Roman Empire, but it was adopted formally by the Holy Roman Empire because these were called free lands, or basically lands where the government itself of the Holy Roman Empire was not able to actually affect. And so they basically permitted this system of justice to be indoctrinated in order to try to bring law to a lawless territory. Much like we had the Old West and we had the roaming judges. Well, this is basically what this was. Only these particular juries were more aggressive, for lack of a better way of saying it. They literally were the judge, juries, and executioners. They were groups of people that traveled around and essentially created their own judgments. They would basically be the judges. They didn't only hear information, they would judge the information. So there was no separation of the judicial process from the jury process, but it was the idea of people going around as citizens being basically deputized to go around and be judges and be members of this system. This particular system was actually called the Vimic, I lost my place in the slides. It's called the Vimic system, VEHMIC. It's basically more of a vigilante kind of system, where people were basically deputized and sent out into the wild to find crimes to punish. But this group of lay judges that moved around and made judgments was really the first effective, in the medieval times, of a jury system. This evolved, of course, over time, and as it came into England around the 12th century, there were groups called hundreds. Now, hundred sounds like a number, just like legion sounds like a number. In this case, 100 was actually a subdivision of a shire in Britain. And the shire, of course, being a territory. So you'd have, and it'd be made up of several villages, and they would come together, and these groups would be called hundreds. And the hundreds would form their own juries. They would find, again, good men to swear and testify to crimes of which they have witnessed, and thereby call upon the group to punish the offenders. In effect, the jury members were both the accusers and the witnesses for the crimes. And obviously, as collectively, they would act as judges as well. Now, in 1166, King Henry II instituted these juries to be adopted all over England. He was so impressed with how the system worked, he thought that they should properly be indoctrinated, and the process and the practice should be instituted all over the country. He did this through something called the Assize of Clarendon, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, because it really looks like ass size. Assize of Clarendon. And it was this act of King Henry II led eventually to the trial by jury, which was the idea that a judge was actually seated up and then 12 members of the jury were impaneled, or whatever number of jury members were impaneled to actually hear cases. This system remained the predominant rule in England. Some evolution occurred, obviously, as juries became more fine-tuned. By 1730, juries were selected by the undersheriff of whatever region or shire or area that the undersheriff actually oversaw. He would actually go around and select the jurors who would attend. Well, obviously, this is the government hand-picking individuals that it wanted to judge the way it wanted to judge, and therefore the concern of impropriety was greatly of issue at the time. And so in 1730, Parliament passed a law called the Bill for Better Regulation of Juries. And this was actually created the first common law system for random selection of jury members, which is what we see so predominantly today. Basically, it would take from the rules, it would post publicly the names of people who could be selected for a jury, and then would randomly, by lot, select from that list of people to determine who would be sitting on each individual jury. Now, this jury form, as it existed at that particular time, was what the American colonies adopted when they formed the United States, and which is why we have the jury system we have today. Now, in the United States, the right to a jury trial is granted through the Sixth Amendment. And I'm actually going to read the Sixth Amendment to you because the language is critically important. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have assistance of counsel for his defense. Now, the language, as I mentioned, is critically important here. It's to be a huge red flag, and I don't know why nobody just sees this and why it's not so obvious that we sit here today and accept the loss of this constitutional liberty when the very language prohibits it. I said it right. The language of that amendment forbids it ever being waived. It says, the language specifically says, in all criminal prosecutions, not some, not the ones we feel like, all criminal prosecutions, that's the language, the accused shall enjoy, not may or might, shall. It is a mandatory element. Under law, you have what's called mandatory, and you have the lesser categories, which are a choice. You have your shall, your must, those are words that are mandatory. May or can or anything like that are not mandatory. They're discretionary. So when the Constitution says the word shall, it is a compulsion upon government that anyone accused of a crime, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of anything else, must have a jury trial. You must have all the elements listed in the Sixth Amendment. It is a shall language. It is not a conditional language. It is not a discretionary language. It is a mandatory language. The government is forbidden to not hold a jury trial. Even if the defendant doesn't want one, the Constitution says you get one. Now, the case of a trial where the defendant says, hey, I want to plead guilty. The jury can hear that and make a quick adjustment and say, okay, he's guilty. He said he's guilty. Plea bargain entered. But his rights are maintained through the process because the Constitution compels it. The founders never foresaw a time in which people could be voluntarily coerced or compelled to testify against themselves. As a matter of fact, the Fifth Amendment prohibits that. It prohibits the compulsory, you cannot be compelled to testify against yourself. That's the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. It was so important, and the founders were so believing that this process would protect against that they made it a mandatory requirement that anyone accused of a crime in the United States of America must have a trial by jury. And yet, here we are. Nothing in the Civil Rights says this is an optional. It does not provide for the right to waive it or set it aside. It does not say unless the accused waives this right. There is no unless. There is no exception. It is mandatory. This must be. And yet, the government of the United States sits back and says, okay, we'll just ignore that part because nobody tells us we can't. And that's not just a fault in Montana, it's a fault everywhere. Because Americans have been conditioned into accepting the way things work. Because the way things are done. It's always been done that way. Well, no, it hasn't always been done that way. The Constitution says otherwise. And a couple episodes ago I talked about the federalism ideal and everything else, about how almost immediately the founders of the country fractured into federalist camps and anti-federalist camps, into centralized U.S. government and non-centralized and power to the states. And of course, in power to the states, also in power to the individuals. You have this rank division almost immediately after the Constitution was filed, because after the Constitution was empowered, because even the founders disagreed on how to implement it. But the principal core still remained the same. These were mandatory prohibitions upon government. These were not optional. These are not selective. These are not individual rights that can be forced to be waived, and most importantly, cannot be compelled to be waived. And yet, here we are. People want to ignore the language, but there's the language. This is a mandatory language. The government is not supposed to be able to take this away. You can't even voluntarily waive it. The Constitution forbids it. The Constitution of the United States, the founding principle on which all law on the land, says it cannot be abandoned. Anyone accused shall have it. It doesn't matter whether they want it or not. They shall have it. That's the Constitution, ladies and gentlemen. That's the language. And yet it's more convenient for government to ignore that part. And largely, we can blame the prison for profit system for that. It didn't start with the prison for profit. It was started long before that. Government officials simply found it easier and more efficient to ignore the inconvenient languages of the law. It's a basic human nature. It's a basic problem we have with corrupt government. This is why I make this podcast, because we have corrupt government who ignores the laws. And yet here we are. This is neither, I'm going to say this one more time, this is neither a voluntary nor involuntary right. It is a mandatory right. Anyone accused of a crime must have a trial by jury, even if the trial is nothing more than them walking in saying, yep, I did it. And then the defense rests, the prosecution rests, the jury goes back, comes back 5 minutes later and says, okay, he's guilty. Even if that's all that's involved, that's the requirement of the law. That's the requirement of the Constitution upon which all law is founded in our country. And yet there it is. They ignore it. The government has been doing this precisely, ignoring this in the United States, in supposedly the greatest democracy in the world. They've been ignoring this since literally the Salem witch trials. And just for anyone who doesn't understand what that means, historically the Salem witch trials were a series of prosecutions and hearings and inquiries and inquisitions that were designed to root out witches. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. The United States, in the governments in and around Salem, Massachusetts of the United States, decided that they needed to root out witches. Because witches were in league with the devil, in league with Satan, and they were helping the Indians and the French in their war against the territories of Salem, Oregon. Or Salem, Massachusetts, sorry. We also have a Salem, Oregon in the United States, by the way. But that's not here nor there. But yes, this was the actual belief. They actually believed the French and the Indians were in collaboration with Satan, and that they had Satan worshippers, witches, infiltrating into the United States territory, into the territories of Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts. And actually, since this was actually before it was a state, it would be the territory of Massachusetts. And essentially what happened is you had mass hysteria. People just were looking for witches everywhere, on every corner. They were charging people with witchcraft. Little more than paranoia and superstition. There was no proof. They didn't have like, okay, here's the spell book, and we actually witnessed this person casting a spell. Though there's a lot of testimonies to that effect. Oh, we saw her spell book, but it burned up in flame. We saw her talking to her cat, but the cat ran away. Something. We saw her flying on a broomstick, but we can't get her to recreate the act. Ridiculously stupid things. But people were paranoid. People were scared. And more importantly, they were scared about being accused themselves. And oftentimes their accusations stemmed around fear of their own fallibility, their own liability, and risk of being harmed. But also petty jealousies. If you ever get a chance to see, there's a movie, I'm trying to remember the name of it right now. I should have written it down. It's The Crucible. The Crucible. It's actually a pretty decent accounting of how the Salem witch trials worked. Probably not 100% historically accurate, but it encapsulates the concept and the idea. It focuses around one small group of girls who decide they're going to bring the charges, and that's how the Salem witch trials start. But it's not historically accurate, but it's not a bad conception of how it all came to be. A little bit fictionalized, but definitely it carries the spirit of what happened in Salem, Massachusetts. But in colonial America, being a witch, as I mentioned, was synonymous with being a Satan worshiper, the devil. In fact, most witches were accused of either being married to Satan or having sexual intercourse with Satan, or doing some other deviantly vile act with Satan himself. Not just his little demons and friends, but with Satan himself. Apparently Satan was sleeping around with all the women of Massachusetts. Or trying to, because he was just that good, apparently. He was corrupting all the women, all the menfolk. And yes, even men were being accused of having sex with Satan. So the concept of gay sex obviously predated the modern age, but we won't even go there. But just keep in mind, this is, as I mentioned, one of the worst cases of mass hysteria in American history. Probably only second to the War of the Worlds fiasco. We won't go into that either. But look it up. War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, his original radio broadcast. Everyone thought it was real. Everyone thought it was real. They started running around all crazy and everything else, and it was mass hysteria. Everyone thought the aliens were invading because the way H.G. Wells presented it like a news broadcast, and everyone believed the news broadcast was real. Mass hysteria. In this case, though, over 200 people were accused of being witches or being in league with witches. 30 were found guilty. 19 people were hanged. 14 of them were women. 5 of them were men. Others died in jail. One was pressed to death, which was where you put massive weights on somebody until the weight collapses their lungs and they cannot breathe and they die. I mean, this is I hate to even look at this as being part of American history, but this is part of American history. This is where, when religious fears and paranoia, or just fears and paranoia in general, don't have to be religious in nature, but although this one was. It doesn't have to be, but fears and paranoia and everything else take over, and mass hysteria, and people believe simply out of fear in a construct that is not real. But the reason why this affects this particular episode, and why I bring this up, is because it's possibly the earliest form of plea bargaining in the United States. Magistrates would approach accused individuals, people who are accused of being witches, and offer them deals. They would promise, now mind you, and being in league with Satan was a death sentence. So if you were in league with Satan, you would be put to death. No ifs, ands, or buts about it, you'd be put to death. You are in league with Satan, your soul is damned to hell. The very fact that these people are murdering people somehow doesn't come into the equation of, hey, we're killing demon worship, Satan worshippers, and that's somehow justified. You show me in the Bible where it says, thou shalt not kill except Satan worshippers. Show me in the Bible where it says that. It doesn't. The Ten Commandments are very clear. Thou shalt not kill. Not that I'm a religious person, but since this is religiously inspired hate and propaganda, it's obviously important to point out the parallels of why this was just so wrong. But the idea here, where the magistrates would offer these accused witches, if they confessed, you can live. You won't die. Well, who doesn't want that deal? I'm either going to die or I'm going to live. And all I have to do is say, I'm a witch. Of course, there's also the plea deals usually accompanied, quite frankly, probably always accompanied, the criteria that they had to identify other witches. The magistrates, they wanted more witches to prosecute. They wanted more people to accuse. They lost their power if they couldn't keep this fear hanging over the populace. So they wanted these confessed witches to point out their brethren, their fellowship, their covens. Who else is a witch? It's the ultimate devil's snare. You get to live, but you got to put other people to death. I mean, I talked about the Crucible. And in the Crucible, there's a character, John Smith, who is put in jail. He's accused of being a witch, being a warlock. And he won't break, and he won't break. And they come to him with a plea bargain. They basically say, hey, we want you to sign a confession that says you did all these things. And if you do, we will let you live. And he's been in jail, which is, in the movie, is literally more than dirt on the ground and like an outhouse. Dirt on the ground, wooden shacks, no insulation, no nothing, subjected to the elements, winter, everything else. He's been there for months. And so his spirit's broken. He says, "Fine, I'll sign it. I'll say whatever you want me to say. Just let me free. Let me be free." And they say, "Okay, well, just sign this piece of paper that says all that we've talked about." And he says, "But why? Why would you have me sign your name? I'm telling you, I will say what you want me to say." "Oh no, but we have to be able to post it around town so people know this is your confession." And he says, rather famously, "But it's my name. All I have left is my name. If you take that from me, I have nothing." And then because he wouldn't sign his name to this document, they put him to death. And that's the lesson here, is that literally they were asked to sign their names to confessions, and in doing so, they also agreed to name other witches and subject other people to this horrific fate of possibly being dead. And it was the first instance of plea bargaining in the United States. Now, to be clear, a plea bargain is defined as an exchange of concessions for a defendant's self-conviction. It's the easiest definition out there. Or, to be more precise, it's offering a lesser penalty for someone confessing to a crime. Oftentimes this includes stacking of crimes, so prosecutors and police officers and whatever law system out there will make multiple charges. Okay, he's a murderer, but we're also going to put a charge of negligence and criminal neglect and all these other charges on there. We just want him to confess to the murder, and we'll drop all the other charges. Or maybe just confess to the lesser charges and we'll drop the murder charge. It's called stacking charges. And the idea is that by increasing the weight and the oppression of these charges, if they can get them to agree to some of the charges, it justifies their detention, it justifies their arrest, and it puts them in the system. But the idea being that you offer either a lesser penalty or remove some other crime in exchange for a guilty confession. Or on the flip side of this argument, on the other side of the coin, it is threatening harsher penalty if they exercise their constitutional right to a jury, because it's always conditional upon the idea that you confess, and when you confess, you waive your right to a jury trial. You also waive your right to appeal, you waive your right to challenge the conviction later on, you waive everything. You just sign this piece of paper and you get less penalty. You don't even have to be guilty. Don't be guilty. Just sign the paper. Just sign the plea bargain and you're free. Or not free, but you'd have a lesser penalty. You won't face the consequence, the long-term consequence, or the longer, harsher consequence that you would if you went to a jury and lost. With the fear of harsher penalty, especially with innocence on the roll of a dice oftentimes, even the innocent tend to accept plea bargains because they don't know they can win. They don't know if they can win, and they are fearful they'll lose their lives if they fail. And I'll talk about it here in a little while, but the defense attorneys oftentimes are just as much of a player in this process as the prosecutor, because they're convincing their client, you don't have a chance, don't take this to jury, you're going to lose. All this evidence you're just not an acceptable risk. I'm advising you as your counsel, take the plea bargain. Plea bargains were usually considered to be inappropriate levels of coercion before the 1960s and 70s. And rightly so. I mean, think about it. It was obviously going on, but people were being threatened and coerced and terrorized into making guilty pleas when they were oftentimes innocent of the crimes of which they were accused. It forfeited their right it made them forfeit their constitutional right, which, as I've mentioned, is not forfeitable as written in the Constitution of the United States. It's not a forfeitable, it's not a waiverable issue. It is a mandatory obligation and a compulsion upon the government. They must provide a jury trial to anyone accused of a crime. You can't waive it. It's not voluntary. It does not say unless the defendant or the accused waives this right. Nothing in there says that. The government is compelled to give a jury trial on each person they accuse of a crime. So to sit here and say that somehow this is justified is broken. Because it's not justified and it's not legal. It's not constitutional. And yet it's been practiced for so long, people just accept it. But yeah, in 1970 even, the U.S. Supreme Court finally came on board. Now keep in mind, as I mentioned, this has been practiced since the 1860s or the 1760s, whatever. I lost my date, on the Salem witch trials. So you have all this going on, and it's just mind-boggling that nobody seems to recognize the idea that this mandatory compulsion element of the Constitution is not binding. Because they don't want it to be binding, and therefore it's not. But like I said, by 1970, the process, it was so widely, even though it was seen as inappropriate, the United States Supreme Court finally legalized it. That's right, the United States Supreme Court said it's legal. And they did it through a case called Brady versus United States. It's, for records, so you want to look it up, it's 397 U.S. 742. U.S. is U.S. reports, by the way. So, volume 397 of U.S. reports, page 742, it's a 1970 case. It's not to be confused, by the way, with Brady versus Maryland, which was dealt with exculpatory evidence and the necessity of government to provide it. So we're not confusing Brady versus United States with Brady versus Maryland. In this case, Brady was a case charged under the Federal Kidnapping Act. The ultimate penalty at the time was before a jury if the kidnapped victim did not survive the kidnap attempt. The ultimate penalty assigned from a jury was death. In this case, and it made it mandatory that whatever the jury came out and decided, the judge had to do. So the jury got to decide the life or death of an individual who was accused of kidnapping, convicted of kidnapping, and then if the individual did not survive the kidnapping attempt, then they could put the person to death. Brady maintained his innocence until his co-defendant changed his plea. And then he agreed to testify against Brady. Up to that point, he thought he could prevail. He thought his case was solid enough he could prevail before a jury. After his co-defendant said, not only am I changing my plea, but I'm going to testify and blame Brady for this, he suddenly became fearful. He became fearful he would be found guilty in front of a jury and given a death sentence. And that's why he accepted a plea deal. He accepted a plea deal for 50 years because that would keep him from being killed. Now, I'm not speaking to his guilt or innocence in this. I don't. It's historically, I'm not going to make that judgment call. But you can't deny the fact that his reason for changing his plea was because he was fearful of death. Now, that's important, very important, as we proceed. After his conviction, after Brady got his 50 years, went off to prison, the U.S. Supreme Court had another ruling, and this one was in 1968. The case was U.S. versus Jackson. Again, 390 U.S. 570. As you'll note, the 1970 case with Brady obviously took 2 years to get to the U.S. Supreme Court after the decision on Jackson. But Jackson ruled that a death penalty under the Federal Kidnapping Act was unconstitutional. Essentially, the court ruled that it makes the risk of death the price for exercising the right to jury, which made it unconstitutional. In other words, the penalty for going to jury trial was so excessive that it was a life or death decision to whether or not to accept your right to do a jury trial. And so the U.S. Supreme Court properly decided that it was unconstitutional to make that kind of a penalty upon the right to a jury trial. Brady appealed his case, arguing that it was the fear of death that compelled his confession. The Brady court stated, "The plea is more than an admission of past conduct, and is the defendant's consent that judgment of conviction may be entered without a trial, a waiver of his right to trial before a jury or a judge. Waivers of constitutional rights not only must be voluntary, but must be knowing, intelligent acts done with sufficient awareness of the relevant circumstances and likely consequences. That's directly from the Brady Court decision. In the case of Brady, the court decided Brady's plea agreement did not qualify. Now, in reading the case law and the history, in my mind, it's pretty clear the U.S. Supreme Court got it wrong. Everything suggests that Brady was more than willing to go to trial when he thought he could win. But once his opponent, or once his co-defendant, said he was going to testify against Brady and blame him for the crime, he was no longer convinced he could win in front of a jury. The win-loss ratio was the deciding factor. He thought he could win before his co-defendant folded and decided to testify against him. He thought he would lose afterwards. Obviously, it was the penalty phase he was concerned with, because he accepted 50 years, which is basically a life sentence. You take a 50-year sentence. Now, mind you, later on it was reduced to 30, but he took a 50-year sentence, plea deal, rather than go to a jury trial and lose and risk death. That was his choices, 50 years or death, because he didn't think he could prevail at a jury trial with his co-defendant saying he did it. And that's obviously the marker. The U.S. Supreme Court said, no, that's not the marker. The U.S. Supreme Court said that Brady was confident, or that his decisions were not compelled by the risk of death. They said his choices were logical, they were knowing, they were properly made. Brady was confident of his chances before a jury, before his co-defendant decided he was going to change his plea and testify against him. Once his co-defendant said he was going to testify against him, with the co-defendant effectively blaming him for the crime, winning was not as certain anymore. Now, with a very real chance of conviction and the consequence of a death sentence, it was obviously the fear of death that compelled his confession. Obviously. You look at the case law, you look at the history, it's obvious that was what compelled him to change his plea. Again, not judging whether he's innocent or guilty of the crime. Honestly, if I were to make a judgment call, I'd say he was probably guilty. I'm not judging whether he was guilty or innocent. I'm saying, from what I've read, he probably was guilty. But then again, I've never spoken to Brady. I don't have his personal information. I don't know anything other than what is in the historical record. So I'm only saying that this is not based upon his innocence or guilt. This is based upon his right and his choice in foregoing a jury trial. Essentially, what Brady did was adopt the plea bargaining as a legal method thereafter, regardless of the compulsion element, regardless of the necessity. Even though it contradicted the other case, it's still, they ruled that Brady was not compelled by his threat of death. But a guilty plea is, and this again comes from the case, a guilty plea is not unconstitutionally compelled when a defendant pleads guilty because they would prefer a certain or probable lesser penalty to the risk of a greater penalty. If the greater penalty is death, ladies and gentlemen, that's huge. But because of that language right there, it doesn't mention death. It says if a person would prefer a probable lesser penalty to the risk of a greater penalty, that's not compulsion. And that language opened up the door to legalizing plea bargains. Because now it can be said that you can offer anybody a lesser sentence in exchange for a compelled change of plea, a compelled confession, compelled self-conviction. This is to say that accepting a plea bargain for a lesser offense is not compulsion. But you're not looking at the other side of the coin when you look at that. Because it is most definitely the fear of a harsher penalty that is the compelling element. It's not if you look at it from this side, it's, oh, he chooses a lesser penalty because it's preferable to the harsher penalty. No, it's the fear of a harsher penalty. That's where compulsion comes in. That's why it's compulsion. It's because it's the fear of the harsher penalty going to trial and before a jury that lends to the change of plea in almost every single plea case. Most humans are not going to sit and confess and admit to a crime they've committed, even when they have done it. The United States Constitution is supposed to protect us against self-incrimination. And yet, here we are saying it's all right to threaten them with harsher penalties, with worse consequences if they go to trial and lose, than if you simply take this and agree to confess to being guilty. And as I said, far too many innocent people who've never committed a crime, who don't know how to defend it, who know their success is going to, I mean, it's a fear. And I can't begin to explain it. The fear of not knowing. I felt it going into trial. I felt it. There was at no point did I believe I was going to win trial. At no point. I had a public defender who was working against me. Could not dismiss him. I had tried. He actually had arranged for 2 of his clients to be witnesses against me. There was no way I was prevailing in a trial. But I wasn't going to confess to something I didn't do. I did not go into that trial thinking that I somehow was going to win. At no point did I think I was going to win. I didn't go into it with any concept or belief that I could win. Everything was working against me. I had no allies. I had no help. I had my own attorney manufacturing witnesses against me. There was no way I was going to win that trial. But I absolutely felt the fear of that. I knew going to trial that I was risking a harsher penalty, and I was very fearful. And I'll confess, before the trial, now mind you, I'll tell you this part, I was never offered a plea deal. I'm probably one of the few people in the world, or in the United States, who ever can say that. I was never offered a plea deal. I told my attorney straight up I was never going to confess to a crime I did not commit. And so he never brought me a plea deal. But he did bring me a deal. It wasn't a plea deal, but it was a trap. I didn't realize at the time, but it was a trap. And here was the trap. He came to me and said, like, the week before trial. Ed Gutierrez-Falla, by the way. F-A-L-L-A, if you want to look it up. He came to me before the trial, a few days before the trial, and said, this is a crap prosecution. They know it. They don't want to go to trial. If you will sign an agreement that says you will submit to a psychosexual evaluation to determine you're not a sex offender, you agree to drop your lawsuit, and you agree to leave Flathead County and never return, they'll drop the charge. That was the one and only time I succumbed. I told him I would take the deal. I was willing to let go of my lawsuit. I knew I wasn't going to be, could not possibly be found to be a sexual deviant under a test because I knew I was not one. So I had no fear of that. That part's the trap, by the way, and I'll explain in a minute. I had no fear of that. And I was willing to leave Flathead County and never return. Now, mind you, that part of it, by the way, is also unconstitutional. It's called a Banishment Clause. It's unconstitutional. But again, I didn't know that at the time. Okay? But it's the Banishment Clause and the psychosexual evaluation, and of course, drop the lawsuit. Remember, I ended up in this because I sued Kalispell. Kalispell arrested me to stop my lawsuit. That's what this is always about. And I'll give Fire one of the few credits I'll ever give the man. He told me that if I ever asked him about it, if I ever confronted about it, he would deny it. He admitted right up front he would deny it if he was ever confronted about it. But he took it up the chain, and he came back the next day and said, no, Lori Adams liked it, but her bosses, quote, he said bosses, by the way, plural, and never to this day know what he meant by bosses, because she's only supposed to have one boss, and that's the head county attorney, Ed Corrigan, at the time. So when he came back and said her bosses wouldn't agree to it, I never have figured out who her bosses were supposed to be. But she said her bosses didn't want to agree to it, and therefore went to trial. But the fear of that consequence was enough to make me agree to drop the lawsuit, leave Flathead County, and take a psychosexual evaluation. Now here's why it was a trap. Psychosexual evaluation in Montana automatically makes you a sex offender. There is no such thing as a sex offender as level 0 in Montana. If you take a psychosexual evaluation in Montana, you will automatically, the lowest designation you can get is a level 1 sex offender. If you take that test, you will automatically be categorized as a level 1 sex offender. I met somebody, and the reason why I know this, of course I went through the test, but I met somebody in prison who actually had that happen to him. He was going through a custody case. His girlfriend had 2 daughters. She died. He was the only parent these 2 girls knew. And he was applying to adopt them. Child Family Services didn't like that idea. Child Protective Services, whatever you want to call them, didn't like that idea. So they were accusing him of being a child molester, and he defended against it, he defended against it, and they were throwing beratement. It's not appropriate for a man to raise 2 little girls. He has to be a deviant. Well, the CPS officer came to him and offered him, hey, I'll tell you what, if you take the psychosexual evaluation and you clear yourself, we'll back off and let you adopt the children. He said, sure, no problem, took the test. The very next hearing, the CPS officer walked in and told the court, Your Honor, here is solid proof that he is a sex offender. He took the psychosexual evaluation and he classified as a level 1 sex offender. Based upon that test, he was prosecuted and thrown in prison. Because he was a sex offender and that test had just proven it. It's impossible to take this test and not be at least a level 1 sex offender because there is no level 0. There is no exoneration under this test. You are automatically classified as a level 1, a level 2, or a level 3 offender. Offender. It's impossible to take this test and be anything else. He went through it, and that's what they wanted to do with me. That's what Ed Fia's trap was. He wanted me, in essence, to self-convict myself by taking a test that would automatically declare me to be a sex offender. Now, mind you, after my conviction, I still took the test, and I still came out as the lowest level we could possibly do. The psychosexual evaluation says no risk of recidivism, no history of sexual deviancy, blah, blah, blah. 1 allegation, no history, no risk of reoffense, no anything. Even Dr. Scalati, who was the one who wrote the test, he's the one who administered the test to me, and even told me, I can't give you a lower than level 1 sex offender or level 1 criteria. He says, but obviously you don't represent a threat. He told this to me. But I can't give you lower than level 1. And that's the trap. This is fear that is instituted by the risk of going to trial. The risk of going to trial is very, very compelling when you think that you're going to face worse consequences for doing so. That is compulsion. It is that fear that is the risk here. So even though Brady tried to say that, or the Brady case tried to say that the defendant somehow wasn't a compulsory process to actually be, or to take the plea bargain, that somehow the threat of death wasn't the actual mitigating factor that made him change his plea, it did actually caution against compulsory process. Brady warned against threats, compulsion, etc. It cited the case Bram v. United States, which, by the way, is 168 U.S. 532. It's an 1897 case. It's very old law, which says free and voluntary, that a guilty plea must be free and voluntary, must not be extracted by any sort of threats or violence, nor obtained by any direct or implied promises, however slight, nor by the exertion of any improper influence. The Brady court actually adopted the summary from the lower court in Brady's case, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which said basically a larger explanation of this. And this is coming from their case, or from their decision. A plea of guilty entered by one fully aware of the direct consequences, including the actual value of any commitments made to him by the court, prosecutor, or his own counsel, must stand unless induced by threats or promises to discontinue improper harassment, misrepresentation, including unfulfilled or unfulfillable promises, or perhaps by promises that are by their nature improper as having no proper relationship to the prosecutor's business, i.e. bribes. Under this standard, a plea of guilty is not valid merely because entered to avoid the possibility of a death penalty. That was the final decision of the Brady court. It just completely went against the earlier decision. It completely went against U.S. v. Jackson. It went against the Jackson decision because it said in the Jackson decision that the threat of death was a sufficient reason to be concerned about one's safety and to worry about whether to exercise the right to a jury trial or not. And yet, 2 years later, they come back and say, nope. The threat of death is not sufficient. Under this standard, a plea of guilty is not invalid merely because entered to avoid the possibility of a death penalty. How is that not compulsory? How is it not compulsory? How is it not a threat? Like I said, in my humble opinion, the court got it wrong, and they got it wrong badly. They got it right in Jackson, they got it wrong in Brady. And it was only 2 years apart. And yet somehow they got it dead on right with Jackson, they got it dead wrong with Brady. And the circumstances were not identical. Again, Brady got it wrong and Bram had it right. A defendant cannot be exposed to fear of a harsher penalty to get confession. That is a threat. That is compulsion. Regardless of whether it's communicated directly or indirectly, whether it's from the prosecutor, the judge, or defense attorney, the end result's the same. The threat of harsher penalty is a threat. Let me say that again. A threat of harsher penalty is a threat. If I say, go in the room where I'm going to hit you, if you go in the room, you don't get hit. If you stay here, you get hit. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a threat. I always use the expression, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck, even if it's holding a sign that says it's a chicken. If you say to somebody that you are going to extend a harsher penalty on them if they do not do this, that is a threat. And if the person complies, it's called compulsion. The United States Supreme Court said compulsion cannot be used to coerce a confession. And yet it is said that plea bargaining, which in and of itself obviously is a threat of harsher penalty if the plea bargain is not accepted, is a threat and it is compulsion. And yet the United States Supreme Court turned around in Brady and said, oh, forget everything we've ever said and allow plea bargaining. And that language is what did it in. Which brings us to something else. Always something else. There's a legal concept called the Courtroom Workgroup. It's a legal foundation that was posited back in 1977 and it was presented by James Eisenstein and Herbert Jacob. They wrote a book about it. Essentially, this idea represents the informal arrangement between prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges. It transforms the adversarial system into a collaboration to make justice efficient. When should justice ever be efficient or convenient? It should never be any of those things. It should be as hard as is necessary to accomplish. In effect, the trial court colludes between people that are not supposed to work together. The judge is supposed to be neutral. They're not supposed to decide cases. They're not supposed to aid one side or the other. They're not supposed to aid the state. They're not supposed to aid the defense. They're not supposed to do their own research or make their own determinations separately. They're supposed to be neutral arbiters of justice. The defense is supposed to present its case. The prosecutor is supposed to present its case. The prosecutor and the defense attorney are supposed to work against each other. Because that's justice. That's how the defense gets a zealous defender. That's how the state gets a zealous prosecutor. And the judge in the middle to decide who's telling the truth. Or actually the best of his ability to decide what the truth is. The courtroom work group principle breaks down this mold. It breaks down the necessity of these people working against each other and instead puts them all in the same boat to cooperate. And this is how it breaks down. It prescribes that all three work together to maximize efficiency of the court system. It's supposedly in pursuit of justice, but obviously it's not anything of nature. It's not pursuit of justice. It's all about moving people through the system as fast as they possibly can, as efficiently as they possibly can. And the process always favors the government. And this is how plea bargains are made. This is where they come in, because they sit together and they collaborate to make the plea bargains. And the plea bargain is put up against the defendant, and the defendant is convinced that he must take the plea bargain or risk this harsher penalty. That's where the courtroom work group comes together. The courtroom work group works upon these standard principles. The courts and judges want to proceed faster rather than affect justice. They're more concerned with speed and efficiency than they are with how much someone suffers or how much justice is paid, just so long as it gets to their court quickly. The less time they have to spend on a case, the happier they are. Okay? Defendants in this system are presumed guilty. Therefore, it doesn't matter. They're going to sit there, they're going to throw their hissy fit. It's like saying, okay, we know the kid took the cookies out of the jar. He's going to throw a fit. He's going to deny to the date, but he's still going to get grounded. Go get grounded because we know you took the cookies. That's basically it. The court, the prosecutor, and the defense attorney work in this collaborative group, in the courtroom work group, with the premise and the idea that the accused is guilty. The prosecutor and the defense attorney weigh the factors together to come up with a plea deal, weighing out the offense versus what they can get off of it, and they come up with a compromise of time. This is all for preserving a quote-unquote healthy working relationship between the three players, because that's more important. It's more important that the prosecutors and the defense attorneys and the judges all get along and have a healthy work environment, and they don't walk away from at the end of the day hating each other. It's more important that they're happy and the person is accused, whether guilty or innocent. It's more important that the prosecutor, the judge, and the defense attorney are happy and get along than it is to make sure the person who's accused is actually guilty. This is often seen as a response because of the overwhelmed public defender system. Because the public defenders simply don't have the resources, the time, or the manpower to simply mount a trial for every criminal defendant. And so therefore they cooperate with the prosecution and the judges in order to simply get their caseload to move through. But it's like saying, okay, the dam is here. We don't want to make a dam that strong. Just bend over and let the water go. Bend over and let the water go. Don't worry about the villages in the valley down below. Just bend over and let the water go. Don't worry about the harm you cause. Just get these off your plate. The real irony here is because of speedy trial right issues. If the defense attorney simply stood their ground, if they simply stood their ground and said, Your Honor, I can't do this. I don't have time. I'm taking client A, B, C, D, and E, and they are all going to trial. I don't have time to give my client F, G, H, and I a dedicated and zealous defense for a trial, and therefore their speedy trial rights are going to expire. You have to dismiss their charges. What a novel concept. Public defenders stand their ground. They insist that they give the full and dedicated time to each and every client. And if that means that some clients fall outside the speedy trial remedy of government, so be it. Penalize the people actually making the prosecutions, not the people actually sitting here being accused. And yet they bend, they cooperate. And that's why the Courtroom Workgroup is so detrimental to the process of American justice. On this podcast, I have talked a lot about the prison for profit system. The prison for profit system certainly did not originate in Montana, but Montana has certainly taken advantage of it. And plea bargains are the cornerstone of empowering the prison for profit system. It is no coincidence the legalization of plea agreements immediately preceded the prison for profit system. Once the dam was opened, the floodgates were opened wide, and the water was allowed to pour out. As soon as all obstruction of the concept of plea agreements went away, every prosecutor across the country got to have no more restrictions or restraints upon compelling, threatening, coercing confessions. You now had a system that could be you can compel and coerce and threaten, despite the fact that the United States Supreme Court said you're not supposed to be able to do that. And even in Brady, it cautioned against it, even though it overruled the idea that Brady himself had been compelled. The Brady court admonished anyone using compulsion to get confessions, and yet this is exactly what the plea bargain system is. Because it's not a coincidence this immediately preceded the prison for profit system, because the prison for profit system grew from the excessively unrestrained prosecutions that resulted from this decision. Without the constitutional protection of a jury trial, more and more people can be forced into the so-called criminal justice system. And most especially, even the innocent fall into the cycle. Look at myself. Here I am, 20 years down the line, and I'm still being accused and attacked online, attacked in public, people still spreading rumors and gossip and nonsense and garbage about me, all for the sake of a conviction of which I was not guilty of. Anybody who actually knows me knows I'm not. Anyone who was there around the time knows I'm not. But people take advantage of it. Just like Angela Townsend, I've talked about her so much in the last two podcasts, about how she takes advantage of the fact that I'm a convicted sex offender to use public opinion to justify her theft of my intellectual property. She wasn't around at the beginning. She wasn't around when this all happened to me, but she was around me for 4 years and never had a problem or concern. She knew I wasn't a threat. She recognized the circumstances and situations. She was fully knowledged that I did not represent a threat and that I was not guilty. And yet, she took advantage of it all the same. But the more people be forced in the system, the more innocent people fall by the wayside as well. The government does not care whether they're innocent or guilty. All they want to do is put bodies in the prison. Because bodies in prison gives them access to the billions of dollars in federal grant money. The federal block grants fund based upon the number of people that are incarcerated in many cases. If you have rising crime, because you have prosecutions that reflect it, if you have people in prison, you need to have money to defund it, to fund those prisons, to keep people, and the state just gets back and just laughs and collects the money. Again, this certainly did not start in Montana. Not plea bargains, not the prison for profit system. But the great Montana conspiracy has taken full advantage of it. It keeps themselves in power, and they get to collect the rewards from the constant influx of cash from the federal government. It roots them in power, it keeps them entrenched, and it keeps them from being challenged because they control and dominate everything through the financial wealth and influence they gain through this system. If you took away the financial benefits, if you took away the resources of this state, if you challenge the method by which they prosecute, whether it be through the information system, whether it be through the plea bargains, whether it be incarcerating people under excessively high bails until they break and confess to crimes they didn't commit, or even the fact that the double jeopardy issue with the suspended time versus the probation time. Take all those factors, any one of those factors, you would bankrupt the state of Montana and the Great Montana Conspiracy would crumble. There would no longer be an incentive for them to seek power in this state, and they would go elsewhere. Or they'd go to prison, because they are the true criminals. What do I know? I'm just a guy in Kalispell, Montana who can't leave. Yeah. I'm the guy who helps everyone, who does all the right things, and I'm the one who so many people hate for no reason. Can't get a girlfriend, can't get financially ahead of myself. I'm restricting the things I can do between my physical disability and the limitations placed on me in the state. I certainly can't leave. All because I challenge this system. And hopefully my words will empower you and give you the ability to spread it, challenge it, affect change. As always, as I end this podcast, I remind you that if you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe, share it. I mean, you can share it with your followers on YouTube, you can share it you can get a shareable link to share over on Facebook, on Instagram, wherever you are. Also, if you're watching this on any other platform and there's no text attached to this video, there is supposed to be text. So if you're just watching the video and it's been separated for some reason, feel free to visit the original source of this podcast, which is monspiracy.podbean.com, where you can see the full video. And of course, you'll always be able to see it in full on YouTube. Thank you for your time. And as I always say as I close these videos, please be safe. And whenever possible, please be free. Thank you.